November 1942, Fairbanks, Alaska. The Soviet pilot's gloved hand hesitated on the door handle of the P-39 Airacobra. After 2 years flying wooden-framed, canvas-covered fighters against the Luftwaffe, Lieutenant Alexei Khlobystov couldn't believe this gleaming aluminum machine was his to fly home. Unlike Soviet aircraft with their Spartan cockpits and basic instrumentation, this American fighter had an automobile-style door, leather seat, and a heated cabin. The smell of new rubber, high-octane fuel, and factory-fresh materials filled his nostrils. Scents that had disappeared from Soviet factories now producing weapons around the clock under constant threat of German bombing. This P-39, one of 1,426 American aircraft that would eventually reach Soviet hands through the Lend-Lease program, represented something Soviet propaganda had insisted was impossible. American industrial capacity that could simultaneously supply its own military while sending thousands of aircraft to allies. The numbers defied understanding. By war's end, American factories would produce 324,750 aircraft, while Soviet factories managed 158,220 despite heroic efforts. This numerical reality contradicted everything Soviet pilots had been taught about capitalist inefficiency. Khlobystov's first pre-flight inspection revealed features unimaginable in Soviet aircraft. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, radio equipment capable of crystal-clear communication over 100 miles, and hydraulic systems operating with a smoothness that made Soviet mechanics shake their heads in wonder. The 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub delivered firepower exceeding most Soviet fighters, its shells capable of destroying German tanks with precision top attacks. In the frigid Alaskan hangar, American technical advisors demonstrated maintenance procedures using specialized tools manufactured to tolerances Soviet workshops couldn't match. The Americans handled million-dollar aircraft with casual confidence, discussing production statistics that stunned their Soviet counterparts. A single Bell aircraft factory in Buffalo, New York, produced 9,584 Airacobras during wartime, more than the annual output of multiple Soviet aircraft factories combined. The Alaska-Siberia route, one of 3 primary Lend-Lease aviation pathways, stretched 6,000 miles across some of Earth's most inhospitable terrain. American pilots would deliver aircraft to Fairbanks, where Soviet pilots like Khlobystov would fly them across the Bering Strait to Siberia, then across the vast Soviet interior to the front lines. During winter months, temperatures reached 63 degrees, cold enough to freeze hydraulic fluid and crack engine blocks. Every successful delivery represented triumph over geography and physics. When Roosevelt extended Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union in November 1941, skepticism ran high on both sides. Americans doubted whether Soviets could effectively use advanced aircraft. Soviets suspected sabotage or deliberate delivery of obsolete equipment. Early interactions revealed mutual misconceptions. American pilots found their Soviet counterparts accomplished aviators who flew without the instruments Americans considered essential. Soviet pilots discovered American aircraft contained technical refinements they had been told represented capitalist excess but actually delivered combat advantages. The contrast between Soviet and American approach to aircraft design manifested in countless details. Soviet aircraft prioritized simplicity, ruggedness, and ease of production. The Yak-1 fighter could be manufactured by factories with minimal technical capacity, its wooden frame constructed by furniture workers. American designs featured complex hydraulics, electrical systems, and multi-stage superchargers requiring specialized manufacturing. Soviet aircraft could operate from unprepared fields but offered minimal pilot protection. American aircraft demanded proper runways but provided armor, self-sealing tanks, and superior survivability. In June 1941, the initial German invasion had destroyed 4,017 Soviet aircraft within days, many never leaving the ground. Entire air regiments vanished, leaving the Soviet Union desperate for replacements. Stalin's order to dismantle and relocate aircraft factories beyond the Ural Mountains had temporarily collapsed production. Into this breach came American aircraft, thousands of them, each representing 9,000 man-hours of skilled labor from a hemisphere away. What Khlobystov couldn't fully grasp during that first Alaskan encounter was that these American aircraft represented not just material aid, but a window into a different industrial paradigm. Each identical aircraft demonstrated standardization beyond Soviet capability. The abundance of spare parts, maintenance equipment, and technical documentation revealed planning and resource allocation that contradicted Soviet assumptions about capitalist waste. As Soviet pilots completed training with American instructors, their initial skepticism transformed into reluctant appreciation. The same features initially dismissed as unnecessary luxury, reliable radios, hydraulic controls, self-sealing fuel tanks, proved to be combat advantages. The P-39's car-like door, originally mocked as evidence of American softness, allowed faster pilot exit during emergencies. The heated cockpit, seemingly decadent, prevented the frostbite that regularly afflicted Soviet pilots in winter operations. Khlobystov and his fellow pilots would soon discover that American aircraft performance matched their impressive appearance. The technical reality of these machines would systematically dismantle preconceptions about American capability, replacing ideological certainty with the irrefutable evidence of engineered excellence. In the skies over the Eastern Front, these American fighters in Soviet hands would become something neither nation fully anticipated: the physical embodiment of an alliance between systems that considered each other existential enemies. January 1943, Abadan, Iran. The Persian Gulf sun beat down on the massive wooden crates disgorged from the Liberty ship's hold. Inside each box, disassembled American aircraft awaited reassembly by teams of American technicians working around the clock in temperatures reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Major Sergei Dolgushin watched as workers in sweat-soaked uniforms carefully extracted a P-40 Kitty Hawk fuselage. This aircraft would soon join his regiment at the Stalingrad front, where temperatures hovered at 30 degrees Fahrenheit, a 150-degree difference that highlighted the global scale of this unprecedented logistics operation. The Persian corridor represented the second major route for American aircraft to reach Soviet hands. Unlike the Alaska-Siberia route where aircraft flew under their own power, these fighters and bombers arrived in crates, requiring 39,000 American personnel in Iran to assemble them. The operation's scale defied Soviet expectations. A single assembly facility in Abadan processed 3,000 aircraft annually, with 165 aircraft often parked in neat rows awaiting Soviet pilots. In Moscow, not even the most optimistic planners had imagined such industrial choreography was possible. The third route, the treacherous North Atlantic path to Murmansk, delivered additional thousands of aircraft. Convoy PQ-17, sailing in July 1942, contained 297 aircraft in crates. German U-boats and aircraft sank 24 of its 35 merchant vessels. Yet the convoys continued, with Americans and British sailors risking death to deliver aircraft to the Soviet Union. This willingness to sacrifice for equipment destined for Soviet use contradicted everything communist ideology had predicted about capitalist selfishness. Each aircraft that survived the journey represented not just a weapon, but a psychological challenge to Soviet preconceptions. Preparation for flight revealed another contrast between systems. American technical manuals for each aircraft type ran to thousands of pages, translated into Russian with precise technical illustrations. Soviet pilots accustomed to 16-page instruction leaflets found these comprehensive documents astounding. The P-39 manual contained 211 pages dedicated solely to the electrical system, more documentation than existed for entire Soviet aircraft. Captain Vladimir Pokrovsky later recalled, "The Americans documented every switch, every wire. We had been taught this represented capitalist inefficiency. In combat, we discovered it represented survival." Pre-flight procedures highlighted different approaches to warfare. Soviet pilots typically performed minimal checks before takeoff, accepting high failure rates as inevitable. American checklists required 24 separate inspection points before engine start and 17 more before takeoff. Initial Soviet reluctance to follow these procedures changed after discovering that American aircraft maintained with proper procedures achieved 91% availability rates versus 64% for identical aircraft maintained using Soviet methods. The mathematics of reliability could not be dismissed as bourgeois excess. American tooling revealed another gulf between industrial systems. Each aircraft arrived with specialized maintenance equipment, precision torque wrenches, calibrated testing devices, and matched tool sets. Soviet mechanics, accustomed to hammers and pliers serving multiple purposes, initially found these specialized tools excessive. Then they discovered American engines lasted 250 flight hours between overhauls, while Soviet engines required complete rebuilding after 100 hours. The standardization enabled by precise tools translated directly into combat availability. The quality of materials told another story of industrial capacity. American aircraft used 24 different aluminum alloys, each optimized for specific requirements: strength, heat resistance, weight reduction. Soviet aircraft used between 2 and 5 alloys depending on availability. The wiring in a P-40 contained copper of 99.97% purity, ensuring electrical reliability. Soviet aircraft used copper of variable quality, requiring oversized wiring to compensate for inconsistency. These material differences weren't theoretical, but translated to 28% lighter American electrical systems with greater reliability. When weather-grounded flights, American liaison officers taught Soviet pilots using training methods that revealed different educational philosophies. Soviet pilot training emphasized rote learning and strict adherence to procedures. American methods incorporated problem-solving scenarios and decision trees. The contrast extended to maintenance training. Soviet technicians memorized procedures. American technicians learned troubleshooting principles. These philosophical differences reflected the broader societal contrast between systems prioritizing individual initiative versus collective conformity. The depth of American technical support infrastructure stunned Soviet personnel. Each aircraft type was supported by technical representatives with direct factory experience, specialized repair depots, and continuous updates to technical documentation. When a P-39 showed unexpected stress cracks after 200 combat hours, American engineers designed a reinforcement kit, manufactured 2,000 units, and delivered them to every operating location within 60 days. This responsive support system contradicted Soviet experiences with their own aircraft, where design flaws often remained unfixed throughout production runs due to bureaucratic obstacles. By mid-1943, these delivery systems had placed 8,244 American aircraft in Soviet hands, equivalent to the entire pre-war Soviet Air Force. The statistics could not be reconciled with communist doctrine about capitalist production. American factories were producing aircraft at rates that suggested not exploitation, but extraordinary efficiency. The aircraft flowing through these 3 routes carried more than weaponry. They delivered irrefutable evidence of an industrial capacity that would transform Soviet understanding of their American ally and reshape their vision of their future adversary. Summer, 1943. Kubinka Airfield, 60 miles west of Moscow. Colonel Alexander Pokrishkin ran his hand along the polished aluminum fuselage of his P-39 Airacobra, the aircraft he would fly to become the second highest-scoring Soviet ace. The fighter's tricycle landing gear, rare in Soviet designs, allowed better forward visibility during takeoff and landing. Soviet pilots had nicknamed this American fighter Kobrushka, Little Cobra, a term of endearment that would have surprised their American allies. Of the 4,146 P-39s delivered to the Soviet Union, 1,030 were flying simultaneously on the Eastern Front at peak deployment, more than the entire fighter strength of many air forces. The P-39's 37mm cannon could penetrate the top armor of German tanks, turning a fighter into a tank destroyer. This dual capability perfectly matched Soviet tactical needs. though this hadn't been the American designer's intention. Soviet pilots discovered that removing 1/800 pounds of American radio equipment and some armor plate improved the aircraft's performance dramatically. What Americans had designed as a high-altitude interceptor, Soviets repurposed as a low-altitude ground attack aircraft. Their adaptation revealed how different combat requirements shaped the use of identical equipment. Stationed at neighboring airfields, the P-40 Tomahawk and Kitty Hawk fighters presented a different set of revelations. American factories delivered 2,397 of these aircraft to the Soviet Union, primarily through the Persian route. Captain Nikolai Golodnikov recalled his first encounter. The P-40 had 8 machine guns when our best fighters had 2. Its pilot armor was steel while ours was plywood. The radio could actually be heard above engine noise. These differences weren't luxury but survivability features. Soviet squadrons operating P-40s suffered 15% fewer combat losses than those flying comparable Soviet aircraft, according to recently declassified military archives. The twin-engine A-20 Boston Havoc attack aircraft arrived in even greater numbers, 3,125 delivered by war's end. Its advanced navigation equipment allowed precision bombing in weather conditions that grounded Soviet designs. Lieutenant Vasily Koleshin's logbook from November 1943 recorded flying 8 consecutive days through winter storms that had grounded all Soviet-made bombers. The heated cabin, previously dismissed as unnecessary comfort, enabled longer missions in sub-zero temperatures without crew frostbite. When fully loaded with 4,000 pounds of bombs, the A-20 still flew 50 mph faster than its Soviet equivalent, the IL-4, while using 20% less fuel per mission. Later in the war, 2,421 P-63 King Cobras reached Soviet squadrons. This improved version of the Airacobra featured a more powerful engine generating 1,800 horsepower, 50% more than the best Soviet fighter engines. Soviet engineers carefully studied its 4-stage supercharger that maintained power at altitudes where Soviet engines lost 40% of their performance. Major Ivan Gaidenko noted in his technical report, "The Americans have solved problems our designers considered unsolvable given wartime constraints. Their metallurgy allows engine operating temperatures we cannot match with our alloys." American medium bombers like the B-25 Mitchell revealed even greater technological advantages. The 861 Mitchells delivered to Soviet forces contain navigation systems allowing precision bombing at night and through cloud cover. The Soviet Air Force had no equivalent capability. Each B-25 carried 150 different instruments in its cockpit, triple what Soviet bombers contained. A single Mitchell could deliver 3,000 pounds of bombs with greater accuracy than a squadron of Soviet SB-2 bombers, allowing precision strikes against bridges and factories that previously required hundreds of sorties. The manufacturing quality of these American aircraft told its own story of industrial capacity. Captain Dmitry Loza wrote in his memoirs, "Every American aircraft part fit perfectly the first time. In our factories, mechanics expected to file, hammer, and adjust parts to make them work together. American interchangeability seemed magical until we understood their quality control systems." Soviet inspectors discovered that American factories rejected 3 to 5% of aircraft components for microscopic flaws undetectable to the naked eye. This level of precision exceeded Soviet manufacturing capabilities, where visual inspection was the primary quality control method. Combat effectiveness statistics eventually silenced even the most skeptical Soviet commanders. Air regiments equipped with American P-39s achieved 6.6 aerial victories per unit loss, compared to 4.1 for the best Soviet fighters. American oxygen systems allowed pilots to fight effectively above 25,000 feet, where Soviet systems became unreliable. The survival rate for pilots shot down in American aircraft was 30% higher, thanks to better armor protection and crash-resistant fuel tanks. These weren't abstract measurements, but calculations in human lives saved and enemy aircraft destroyed. Soviet engineers noted that American aircraft maintained performance consistency despite being mass-produced. The 100th P-39 performed identically to the first, while Soviet production showed significant variation between individual aircraft of the same model. This consistency resulted from manufacturing tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, enabled by precision machine tools beyond Soviet industrial capability. A typical American factory used 23 quality inspections during aircraft production, compared to 7 in Soviet plants. The results were visible in aircraft that required 30% less maintenance and delivered 96% mission availability, statistics Soviet production couldn't match despite heroic efforts. As Soviet pilots accumulated experience with these American aircraft, initial skepticism transformed into grudging respect and eventually into preference. By 1944, Soviet ace pilots competed for access to American aircraft, recognizing their combat advantages. The technical gap couldn't be dismissed as propaganda. It existed in measurable performance differences, in combat statistics, in survival rates, and in maintenance requirements. For Soviet military leaders, these American aircraft delivered not just combat capability, but an education in what industrial democracy could produce, an education that would influence Soviet aviation development for decades after the war ended. March 1944. Tula Air Base, Soviet Union. Technical Sergeant Mikhail Karpov opened the maintenance manual for the P-39 Airacobra to a carefully tabbed page showing the hydraulic system schematic. After 2 years working with American aircraft, what once seemed like excessive documentation now represented the difference between mission success and failure. The American approach to maintenance, thorough, systematic, and preventative, contradicted Soviet practice of flying until something broke, then fixing only what had failed. Soviet mechanics initially viewed the 200-hour inspection schedule as wasteful bureaucracy until they discovered it doubled engine lifespan and reduced catastrophic failures by 78%. The logbooks accompanying each American aircraft told a story of industrial culture shock. Each P-39 arrived with a complete history. Date of manufacture, test flight results, even the names of primary assembly workers. Soviet aircraft rarely came with any documentation at all. American aircraft required recording of all maintenance actions, parts replacements, and flight hours. This paper trail initially seemed like capitalist excess until Soviet commanders analyzed the data and discovered patterns allowing them to predict failures before they occurred. Colonel Nikolai Chebukov noted, "Their seemingly wasteful record-keeping actually conserves resources through prevention. This contradicts our understanding of American wastefulness." The supply system supporting American aircraft revealed another cultural divide. When ordering replacement parts for Soviet aircraft, mechanics expected weeks of delay and often received incorrect components. American parts arrived in standardized packaging with identifying numbers that corresponded exactly to maintenance manuals. A replacement carburetor for a P-63 King Cobra ordered on Tuesday would arrive Friday via the Alaska-Siberia route. The American supply catalogs contained 23,560 individually numbered components for a single aircraft type, a level of organization that stunned Soviet logisticians accustomed to improvising with whatever materials were available. Soviet mechanics encountered the bewildering American concept of planned obsolescence when discovering that certain components were designed for replacement after specific time intervals regardless of apparent condition. Fuel pumps were replaced after 200 flight hours even when functioning perfectly. This practice seemed wasteful until analysis showed that pumps typically failed catastrophically between 210 and 240 hours, often causing aircraft loss. By replacing components before statistical failure points, American maintenance philosophy traded higher supply consumption for dramatically improved survival rates. The mathematics were irrefutable. 20% higher supply consumption yielded 300% lower accident rates. The cultural exchange extended beyond maintenance practices. American liaison officers working at Soviet bases brought photographs, magazines, and personal items that provided glimpses into American life. Captain Viktor Belyakov recalled a Life magazine showing American supermarkets. The food abundance in these civilian shops exceeded our officers' special stores. We were told this was propaganda, but the American officers' casual confirmation suggested otherwise. They described these stores as normal, not exceptional. These incidental exposures to American living standards created more powerful impressions than any formal propaganda. Training materials revealed philosophical differences between societies. American training films for aircraft maintenance showed individual initiative, mechanics identifying and solving problems independently. Soviet training emphasized collective responsibility and following established procedures without deviation. The American approach produced mechanics who could improvise solutions to unexpected problems. The Soviet system created teams that executed standard repairs with high consistency. Both had advantages, but the American method proved better suited to field conditions where unique combat damage required creative solutions. Technical documentation for American aircraft included information Soviet manuals never provided, the reasoning behind design decisions. The P-39's unusual mid-engine placement was explained in development notes that detailed trade-offs between center of gravity, visibility, and firepower. Soviet manuals simply specified configurations without explaining engineering rationale. This transparency allowed Soviet mechanics to understand not just how to maintain American aircraft, but why specific systems were designed as they were. The educational impact extended beyond immediate maintenance to influence Soviet engineering philosophy. The sensory experience of American equipment created lasting impressions. Soviet pilots noted the smell of American cockpits, leather seats and rubberized canvas, rather than the wood and doped fabric of Soviet aircraft. The synthetic rubber fuel tanks had distinctive odors different from the metal tanks in Soviet designs. Even the sound differed. American radios produced clear voices without the static that plagued Soviet communications equipment. American instrument panels used standardized green illumination rather than the haphazard mix of colors in Soviet cockpits. These sensory differences weren't merely aesthetic, but reflected standardization that improved night vision and reduced pilot fatigue. American rations included with aircraft deliveries provided another revelation. Each P-63 arrived with a small supply of emergency rations: chocolate bars, powdered coffee, dehydrated soup, cigarettes, and chewing gum. The chocolate contained more cocoa butter than Soviet generals could obtain. The coffee tasted richer than the ersatz mixtures available to Soviet frontline units, and the cigarettes were consistently manufactured with paper that didn't unravel when lit. These seemingly minor items demonstrated quality control, extending even to consumables, suggesting an economy where scarcity had been conquered so thoroughly that even disposable items maintained high standards. By 1944, these daily interactions with American equipment had transformed Soviet perceptions more effectively than any propaganda effort could have achieved. The psychological impact wasn't delivered through arguments, but through direct experience with physical objects that performed as specified, arrived when promised, and maintained consistency across thousands of examples. Against the material reality of 14,000 American aircraft operating alongside Soviet designs, ideological claims about capitalist inefficiency collapsed. The everyday evidence mounted in maintenance bays and cockpits across the Soviet Union, unfolding one aircraft at a time, one replaced part at a time, one successful mission at a time. A revolution in perception delivered through hydraulic fluid and aluminum, through radios that worked and engines that started reliably in the Russian winter. September 1944. Aircraft Factory, number 153, Novosibirsk, Siberia. Engineer Pavel Sukhoi studied the disassembled Allison V-1710 engine removed from a battle-damaged P-40. His notepad filled with detailed sketches of components Soviet industry couldn't duplicate. Under Stalin's direct orders, Soviet aircraft designers were systematically reverse engineering American aircraft, extracting technological lessons from every wire, hydraulic line, and aluminum spar. What began as simple operation of American aircraft had evolved into a massive knowledge transfer program that would reshape Soviet aviation for decades. Soviet modifications to American designs revealed priorities shaped by Eastern Front conditions. Maintenance crews removed 238 pounds of radio equipment from each P-39, keeping only basic communication gear. The empty space was filled with additional ammunition and simplified Soviet-made oxygen systems. Gun sights designed for high-altitude precision were replaced with simpler Soviet reflector sights, better suited for low-level ground attack. These modifications transformed the Airacobra from an interceptor into the dedicated ground attack fighter Germany feared on the Eastern Front. By war's end, the highest-scoring Soviet aces, Pokrishkin with 59 victories and Rechkalov with 58, had achieved most of their success in American P-39s, modified to Soviet requirements. The transfer of knowledge worked in both directions. American technical representatives visiting Soviet airbases observed maintenance innovations born of necessity. Soviet mechanics developed rapid engine warm-up procedures for operations in 40-degree calm temperatures, techniques later adopted by American units in Alaska. They created simplified field repairs for battle damage that American engineers had assumed would require factory-level maintenance. A Soviet method for emergency hydraulic system repair using local materials was so effective that Bell Aircraft incorporated it into their official field maintenance manuals in 1944. Soviet technical education transformed as engineers encountered American designs. New courses at the Moscow Aviation Institute focused specifically on American manufacturing techniques, particularly aluminum extrusion methods that reduced aircraft weight while maintaining structural strength. Captured German documents revealed that Luftwaffe pilots specifically mentioned Soviet-flown Airacobras as particularly dangerous opponents, unaware these were American-built aircraft. By 1944, Soviet pilots in American aircraft had developed combat tactics specifically exploiting their strengths, using the P-39's exceptional rate of roll for defensive maneuvers and the P-63's superior high-altitude performance for ambushing German bombers. The elite Soviet 9th Air Army, equipped entirely with American aircraft, achieved a 4.6.1 kill ratio against the Luftwaffe in 1944, significantly higher than units operating Soviet designs. This combat effectiveness couldn't be explained away by pilot skill alone, forcing Soviet leadership to acknowledge the technical advantages American designs offered. When American liaison officers visited frontline airfields, they found their aircraft modified in ways factory engineers hadn't anticipated. The Soviet practice of stripping unnecessary equipment reduced weight by 12%, improving climb rate and maneuverability beyond American test specifications. Technical documentation captured from German units revealed that the Luftwaffe had developed specific countermeasures against American aircraft in Soviet service. German pilots were instructed to avoid low-altitude engagements with P-39s and to prevent A-20 bombers from establishing consistent attack patterns. This tactical respect from enemies provided further confirmation of these aircraft's effectiveness. German intelligence reports mistakenly concluded that the Soviet Union had acquired American manufacturing technology, unable to believe these were simply transferred aircraft. Soviet engineers studying American designs noted that seemingly wasteful redundancy, backup systems and safety margins actually improved combat survivability. American aircraft typically included duplicate control cables, secondary hydraulic systems, and electrical backups that Soviet designs omitted to save weight and manufacturing complexity. Analysis of combat losses revealed that Soviet aircraft suffered catastrophic losses when single systems were damaged, while American designs often returned with multiple systems damaged but backups functioning. This lesson in engineering philosophy would influence Soviet aircraft design for the next 30 years. Famous Soviet fighter regiments developed intense loyalty to their American equipment. The 16th Guards Fighter Regiment, commanded by Pokrishkin, refused replacement with newer Soviet designs, preferring to maintain their battle-tested P-39s. Their mechanics had developed such expertise with these aircraft that they achieved 94% availability rates, higher than American units operating the same equipment. When factory representatives from Bell Aircraft visited in late 1944, they found Soviet mechanics had created specialized tools to improve maintenance procedures beyond those in the official manuals. Knowledge transfer became increasingly formalized as the war progressed. Soviet engineering teams documented every aspect of American aircraft, creating 200-page technical analyses of each major type. Stalin established special design bureaus tasked with incorporating American technical solutions into Soviet aircraft. The swept-wing configuration, later used on the MiG-15, was directly influenced by technical data from the Bell P-63. The pressurized cockpit systems in post-war Soviet bombers showed clear American influences, particularly in oxygen system design and electrical heating elements. By early 1945, the 14,000 American aircraft delivered to the Soviet Union had not only helped win the air war against Germany, but had fundamentally altered Soviet understanding of aircraft design, manufacturing, and maintenance. Though political tensions would soon erase public acknowledgement of this debt, within Soviet aviation circles, the technical impact of these American aircraft was undeniable. Aircraft that arrived as emergency wartime aid had become the foundation for a technological revolution in Soviet aviation. The knowledge extracted from these fighters and bombers would shape Soviet aircraft for decades, creating an ironic legacy. American engineering excellence contributing directly to their Cold War adversaries' technological development. What began as simple material aid had evolved into perhaps the largest inadvertent transfer of aviation technology in history. May 1947. Ramenskoye Flight Test Center, outside Moscow. Test pilot Grigory Sedov climbed from the cockpit of the prototype MiG-15, a fighter that would soon shock Western observers in the skies over Korea. What they couldn't see beneath its swept wings was the technological DNA of American Lend-Lease aircraft. The MiG's 37mm cannon matched the caliber of the P-39's primary weapon. Its cockpit pressurization system borrowed design elements from the P-63. Its hydraulic system incorporated lessons from thousands of hours maintaining American equipment. Though officially unacknowledged, American engineering lived on in what would become the Soviet Union's most iconic Cold War fighter. Stalin's 1946 order to the Soviet aviation industry had been explicit. Study the American technical solutions and incorporate their advantages. The resulting knowledge transfer manifested across Soviet design bureaus. Lavochkin's LA-9 fighter featured an all-metal stressed skin construction directly influenced by American methods. Tupolev's Tu-4 bomber was an exact copy of the American B-29. Yakovlev fighters adopted American-style control surface balancing. These weren't coincidences, but deliberate incorporation of lessons learned from operating 14,000 American aircraft on the Eastern Front. As one Soviet engineer noted in a classified 1949 report, American design taught us that reliability isn't luxury but necessity. The industrial lessons proved as valuable as the technical ones. Soviet factories adopted American-style quality control methods, particularly in aircraft engine production. The standardized testing procedures used at Factory No. 26 in UFA were direct adaptations of Allison engine plant practices. Soviet aluminum extrusion facilities built in 1946-48 used manufacturing processes reverse-engineered from P-39 components. The precision hydraulic manufacturing techniques that enabled the MiG-15's responsive control system came directly from studying Bell aircraft hydraulic components. Even sheet metal forming dies showed American influence in their stress relief patterns and cooling channel design. Cold War realities created strange ironies. During the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, Soviet pilots who had trained on American P-63s found themselves flying MiG-15s against American F-86 Sabres. The aerial combat techniques they employed had been developed while flying American aircraft against the Luftwaffe. Some Soviet pilots privately noted that their understanding of American fighter tactics came from years of flying Lend-Lease aircraft. A Soviet pilot captured in Korea reportedly told his American interrogators, "I learned to fly in your P-63 King Cobra. Now I use those same skills against you in my MiG." Official Soviet histories systematically minimized Lend-Lease contributions after 1946. Stalin's pronouncement that the Soviet people won the Great Patriotic War through their own efforts became mandatory historical interpretation. Wartime photographs were altered to remove American aircraft. The 14,000 American planes, approximately 18% of all Soviet combat aircraft during the war, vanished from official accounts. This historical erasure created the ultimate irony. Soviet pilots who had defeated the Luftwaffe while flying P-39s couldn't mention these victories in their memoirs. Heroes like Alexander Pushkin, who scored 48 of his 59 victories in American aircraft, found their equipment politically unmentionable by the 1970s. American influence appeared in unexpected places throughout the Cold War. The standardized maintenance procedures adopted for Soviet jet fighters in the 1950s clearly descended from American practice. The technical documentation system used by Soviet naval aviation borrowed its structure from translated Bell aircraft manuals. Soviet aviation fueling equipment manufactured until the 1970s used filter systems based on American designs. A Soviet aerospace engineer who defected in 1968 told American intelligence that the entire Soviet approach to aircraft electrical system redundancy came from studying American designs, which had demonstrated superior survivability when damaged. Modern Russian historical reassessment has finally acknowledged what veteran pilots and engineers always knew privately. In 2015, the Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow opened an exhibit specifically dedicated to Lend-Lease aircraft, displaying a restored P-39 alongside recognition of the program's significance. Russian aviation historians now publicly acknowledge that American aircraft formed a crucial component of Soviet air power. Veterans organizations have published memoirs previously suppressed, revealing the extent to which famous Soviet aces relied on American equipment for their success. Archaeological expeditions in remote areas of eastern Russia regularly discover crash sites of Lend-Lease aircraft along the Alaska-Siberia route. A P-63 King Cobra, discovered in the Siberian wilderness in 1997, had landed on a frozen lake during a 1943 delivery flight, breaking through the ice during spring thaw. Remarkably preserved by the cold water and low oxygen content, this aircraft now resides in a Moscow museum as physical evidence of this massive transfer program. For many Russian visitors seeing these artifacts for the first time, the scale of American assistance contradicts 70 years of minimization. The most profound legacy remains in Russian aviation design philosophy. The Soviet emphasis on backup systems and component redundancy that characterized their Cold War aircraft descended directly from American influence. The standardization practices that enabled mass production of MiGs reflected lessons learned from operating standardized American designs. Even the Russian approach to aircraft maintenance scheduling still shows the impact of American procedures that Soviet mechanics initially considered wasteful but ultimately recognized as essential for combat readiness. These engineering philosophies transcended political systems, surviving even as the nations became adversaries. The ultimate irony of this massive technology transfer lies in how it shaped the Cold War itself. American aircraft delivered to a desperate ally in 1941 to 1945 provided not just immediate combat capability, but education that helped create the Soviet aerospace industry Americans would face for the next 50 years. The P-39 Airacobra, designed to defend American cities, instead became the mount of the Soviet Union's greatest aces. Engineering knowledge extracted from these fighters and bombers influenced aircraft that would later face American pilots over Vietnam and Afghanistan. This unintended consequence of wartime alliance represents perhaps history's most significant inadvertent technology transfer. a story of how 14,000 aircraft delivered not just firepower, but knowledge that would shape the century's greatest geopolitical confrontation. In the end, the Soviet pilots who marveled at American-built fighters in 1942 could never have imagined how profoundly these aircraft would influence their nation's technological development. The American mechanics who demonstrated maintenance procedures couldn't have known they were training future Cold War adversaries. The transformation initiated when American aircraft first landed on Soviet soil extended far beyond the immediate military emergency, reaching across decades to shape the technological competition between superpowers. In this unexpected way, American generosity to a wartime ally helped create the very aerospace capability they would later face across the Cold War divide.